My name is Randy Shriver, and I'm president of Project 2049 and a founding partner at Armitage International. And I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you, Ian and others, and Barry at the Atlantic Council for the invitation. And I got to say, if I wasn't sitting up here, I would want to be sitting out there, because this is really an all-star panel, and I think will lead us in an excellent discussion here. You have the bios, so I won't spend a great deal of time, but just very briefly from the far end toward me. First speaker will be Dr. Kurt Campbell. I think well known to everyone here, is now president of the Asia Group, previously served as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. Next to him, Amy Chang is now the staff director for the Subcommittee on East Asia for the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and has worked at a number of think tanks in Washington. I think she's probably most proud that she spent a little time at Project 2049. And then Dr. Michael Green, who is at CSIS, also a professor at Georgetown, and I think is well known for his service in government as Senior Director for Asia on the National Security Council during the Bush administration. So I won't spend any more time teeing this up. Since we have such a fabulous panel, I will only note that Dr. Campbell has a family situation that has come up and will need to leave a little bit early, but we'll get through the remarks first before he will have to leave. So,
thank you, Randy. Great to see so many friends in the audience, and I just want to say, just stop for a moment and say congratulations. I don't know if you want to. So Amy is going to be commissioned in the Navy later today, and that's a tremendous honor for her, but also a great tribute to her service in addition to what she's doing on Capitol Hill. So we appreciate her taking the time to do this today. I think we can do this. So, and again, Ian, thank you very much for having this session today. So we've talked a little bit about how to divide the discussions today, and I'm going to start at the strategic level and particular issues that are animating our overall engagement in the Asia-Pacific region. I think at the top of the list is the demand signal for American strategic engagement across the board has never been higher, and it's really going up, if anything. There is concern about declining defense budgets. There is anxiety about whether we're going to be able to follow through with respect to TPP. Most Asians want U.S.-China relations to be in a band. 2 years ago, there was a worry that the United States and China were trending too much towards some sort of condominium. Today, there's anxiety after a particularly tense strategic and economic dialogue that we are veering towards a much more combative, challenging relationship over the course of the next 10 years. I would say that evolution is probably natural, but it will take some time to adjust to. In addition, I think there is a recognition that each of our key partners and allies are in the midst of substantial reorientations of their national defense strategy. At the top of that list is Japan. Mike Green is the best expert on this of anyone. But as we speak, Prime Minister Abe and his team are involved in an extraordinarily intense effort to essentially update their national security architecture and engagement, and they're facing really quite substantial domestic opposition. Issues associated with ballistic missile defense in Japan are expensive and they're complex. Many of the big programs that were undertaken, those budgets came in 2006, 2007, when Mike was at the NSC, and then subsequently under the previous government. In the new environment that Prime Minister Abe has articulated, in which there will be increases in defense spending, there is more focus on activities that are perhaps less inclined towards simply defense. Mike and Amy will talk about work underway in Guam, the dynamics that we're facing in both Japan and South Korea, some of the flirtations we've had from countries in Southeast Asia and Australia. They put a strain on our existing institutions and our coordination mechanisms. I will tell you from my experience in the Pentagon and also my experience at the State Department, one of the areas that I would like to see slightly better focus on is how the agency engages, the Ballistic Missile Defense Agency engages with its partners in government. I think there's going to be a much greater need for greater coordination, not just in the Pentagon, but in a broader array of partners in the State Department and the White House as well. I think in this environment with scarcer resources, and here I think one of the keys as you travel to the Pentagon and out to the region, Mike just got back from Hawaii, and I spend a lot of time in the Pentagon these days for the Defense Policy Board. I am struck by the recurring theme that one hears from senior officials that, look, just give me the opportunity to get up on Capitol Hill and we will get through this budget impasse and we will find our way to a new equilibrium in which we will see more of our projects funded and greater flexibility associated with the defense budget. I think that is a fundamental misreading of what's going to happen in the United States, and I think we are stuck with this sequestered capabilities. To see Corey nodding her head for the foreseeable future. And I think even though no one can come right out and say it, we have to start thinking a little bit more creatively accordingly. Ballistic missile defense in Asia is hurt by some of these constraints substantially. And I will tell you what I've been struck by, at least over the course of the last several years, is that there are growing questions about focus in several countries. I will tell you quite honestly, the focus that we've had in the United States on South Korea has been on the very public pressure that China has placed on South Korea, right? But in truth, there is another story beneath that, which is the deep ambivalence of the Korean people, even on the security side, about whether major investments in THAAD and other programs are in their best strategic interests. So in fact, China complicated a situation in a way that if they had remained silent, I think the Korean government might have decided, at least for the time being, to wait. Now with very clear public pressure and a very keen Korean nationalist sense that, look, we are a great country and we need to make our own strategic decisions. These the
most logical thing for them to pursue right now. And so, you know, the unique security situation with North Korea and the need to protect our allies and forward deployed forces really drives a lot of the BMD policies that we have. And we face a lot of impediments, I have to say. It lacks, BMD in Asia lacks the sort of multilateral collaboration that exists in Europe. And it's hard because of all the histories and the cultures and the dynamics in the region that prevent us from sort of pushing for that sort of multilateral architecture. Other major impediments include, I'm going to focus on South Korea here. First and foremost, the South Korea-Japan relationship has not been ideal. This year is especially sensitive year for the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II. Tensions have been high all year, and I think they'll consistently continue to be that way through August, September of this year. And that may be a major limiting factor. And we signed an MOU with Japan and South Korea to do information sharing, but collaboration so far on that has been pretty limited. And even if the historical issues are solved, I still think there are several other major impediments to creating a better regional BMD architecture in the region. So whether, first it goes into what Kurt said, whether Korea thinks it actually could provide more value to the country, or whether it would entrench upon their strategic autonomy. There's a lot of ambivalence with the Korean population as to whether or not they want greater U.S. presence in Korea. And second, even if they did want that, I mean, how would they pay for the increased and improved BMD capabilities? One THAAD system costs about $800 million, and Korea's defense budget last year was $33 billion. So, you know, if they're going to think about how they're going to be able to fund these things, that's another consideration that we need to have and consider. And the third point I have is China and Korea relations. China's been convincing Korea to reject that and not have this type of relationship with the United States. And it also is convenient because China and Korea share a common history of sort of a lot of history and mistrust with Japan, and so they can capitalize on that sentiment as well. China is Korea's also largest trading partner, and according to President Park in a statement recently, China has a huge role to play in upholding peace and stability on the Korean peninsula. And because of that, she will continue to maintain strategic ambiguity on the issue, not necessarily giving us a definitive answer on whether or not THAAD could eventually be deployed in the region. So until we can address all of these issues, then our desire to rebalance or phase in BMD capabilities in the region will be severely hampered, and our desire to do so will remain just that, a desire. So, what could the United States, and specifically what could the U.S. Congress do to try to alleviate those tensions, to try to boost awareness of this issue? So first, I think that contrary to what Kurt mentioned, I think BMD has always had congressional support and has always been funded at the requested values. So that's a good thing. I mean, so if we can justify further expansion of BMD in Asia, I think Congress is pretty sympathetic to the issue. Second, I think we need to continue to provide assurances to our partners in the region, especially Korea, as well as to continue to reassure China and Russia that we're not, improving our capabilities and our presence there to undermine their nuclear deterrence. And along with that, I think we should also have hearings on the issue. And later this month, the Asia and Pacific Subcommittee will be holding a hearing on bilateral alliances in Asia. And it'll be a good opportunity to talk about the progress that US and Japan have made, but also highlight the potential value that Korea could play in a trilateral agreement, bilaterally. Then we need integration costs and see better information, and that we promote a collective approach. I think we could think outside of the box and promote more to bolster these trusted relationships that we already have, US-Japan, US-Korea. Maybe we could anonymize the information that's being shared so that Korea doesn't feel that the information is skewed if it comes from Japan or the United States. So all of these issues, I think, or all of these suggestions, I think, could actually help alleviate the tensions as well as promote greater U.S. presence and ballistic missile defense capabilities in Asia.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks, Amy. The Hill, over the last 6 months or year, has really stepped up on these kinds of issues. Amy's boss and the House International Relations Committee, the HASC, the SASC, and SFRC have really stepped up and added some discipline to the policy debate in the administration, and also I think sent very reassuring signals to allies as well. So I'm very happy to be here. Always glad to be invited by Barry. I'm always impressed by the discussion here. I missed the lunch. I just noticed the cookies. I'm really impressed by the cookies. Those are big cookies. We don't have cookies that big at CSIS.
Just fling one of those up. You could take out some missiles with those, Barry.
And if you've ever seen CNAS's teeny little cookies, so let me say a few things about the geopolitics of missile defense in the Asia-Pacific theater, and then add a few supplementary comments to Amy's on the allies. We are obviously playing a complicated three-dimensional chess game with China. We're trying to leverage interdependence. We're trying to shape the theater diplomatically with things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership in trade, with multilateralism, with new relationships building with India and Indonesia. But we're also having to underpin all of that with a certainty that we can fight tonight, that we can deter and defeat aggression against us or our allies in the Western Pacific. Missile defense touches on all of these in a pretty profound way. In terms of deter and defeat, if Beijing thinks, or our allies think, that we'll be deterred from intervening in an aggressive act against Japan and the Senkakus, the Philippines and South China Sea, or Taiwan, because we're scared of the vulnerability of Guam, Kadena, to ballistic missiles. Then deterrence is weakened, and our larger game to avoid conflict and avoid revisionism on a strategic level is weakened, and so it goes right to the heart of what underpins all of the non-kinetic, non-military things the United States tries to do to make sure that we develop a relationship with China over time that is benign. And missile defense goes right to the heart of it. Some people get this completely wrong by saying, well, missile defense isn't going to, quote unquote, solve the ballistic missile problem. That's not how you think about it. We deal with the ballistic missile threat by complicating the other guy's planning. And so missile defense has to be part of a larger strategy that involves not only defense, but dispersal, hardening, and an interoperability and jointness with our allies that complicates planning. And often people get this all wrong and just sort of count how many THAAD batteries we have and how many missiles they have and say, game over, we should focus instead on trade and other things. It's just the wrong way to think about it. Missile defense is becoming a critical definition of how our alliances in Asia are going to progress. The Chinese assumption, I believe, is that over time, because of growing dependence on Sino-centric trade and so forth, our allies will slowly be weaned from the United States. It'll be a combination of attraction through trade and $4 trillion in surpluses, capital surpluses Beijing has, and some elements of coercion to demonstrate, especially in the South China Sea, the U.S. doesn't have game, and geography, and that the assumption over time is that the alliance system, the 1951 San Francisco Alliance hub and spoke system, is a sort of footnote in history, not the natural state of the Asia-Pacific geopolitical order. I don't think that's right. I don't think most of our allies think that's right. Missile defense goes right to the heart of this because the introduction of missile defense capabilities technologically requires us to be essentially joint and combined with our allies. And the best example is Japan. We do not have a joint and combined command with Japan. We never have. They never wanted it. We never pushed for it. The Soviets until Reagan and the Chinese until Kurt Campbell and the Nye Initiative in the 1990s thought they could divide Japan in a crisis. I do not believe the Chinese make that assumption anymore. I think the Chinese planning assumption is under any contingency in the first island chain Japan is in. Now, the Japanese government has never made that explicit, but the tactical capability is there and the interest is there. And one of the drivers is missile defense. So in Yokota, the only thing comparable to a joint and combined command we have is air and missile defense, where US and Japanese officers basically sit side by side in front of computers. If you've been to the Combined Forces Command or the bunker in Korea, that's the norm, or NATO, that's sort of the norm. But in US-Japan, it has never been the norm, but now it's becoming that way because missile defense is driving it. Chinese can assume they cannot separate the US-Japan in a crisis in the first island chain. I think that Beijing thinks it can separate Korea. And the last thing Beijing wants is for the Koreans to be in Link 16 and seeing the same threat picture and managing the response with us and, God forbid, the Japanese or the Australians. So in a way, this is the natural evolution of an alliance and a series of alliances based on our common defense, or in the case of Japan, the defense of Japan. This is what our alliances should be doing. The technological threat is new, the technological response is new. But what it looks like to Beijing is technology is making these alliances a lot more enduring, a lot more joint, a lot more combined than their assumption. And so they hate it. So a lot of the Chinese attack on Korean missile defense or on the US deploying THAAD, it's not about the threat to their missiles. The Chinese intercontinental ballistic missiles and medium-range ballistic missiles have all moved and are mobile and are not on the coast anymore in many cases, and are basically outside of a THAAD battery based near Camp Humphreys, outside of that envelope. What this is really about is China testing if it can dictate the terms of Korea's security going forward. Then the third geopolitical piece, in addition to underpinning deterrence, complicating enemy planning, which is essential for everything we do to keep Asia safe in peacetime. And, of course, the future of the alliances. The third piece is the credibility of extended deterrence in Asia. So for all of our allies, but especially Japan and Korea, the fact that the DPRK has, in the course of 15 years, gone from almost zero to well over 200 missiles that range Japan, that the Chinese MRBM, medium-range ballistic missile inventory, is growing exponentially, that the Chinese in open literature are talking about war-fighting options for tactical nuclear weapons with Japan and so forth. You know, all, the fact that the KN-08, you know, could not before too long reveal itself as a capability of a missile that could hit the West Coast. I'm from Washington, you know, whatever. But if you're our allies, it brings back the old de Gaulle line, are you going to trade LA for Tokyo or Seoul? So the credibility of extended deterrence is something we can't take for granted. We have to keep shoring it up. Working with allies on missile defense is a critical piece of that. So it's more than just a technological solution to a missile threat. It goes to the heart of the future of Asian order. Few quick things to highlight. On Japan, they are, Amy said arguably, thanks Kurt, I would say they are worldwide our most significant partner in missile defense right now. And there's not a lot of debate in Japan about this anymore, not compared to 15 years ago, because the threat is so obvious. In 2018, the SM-3 2As will start being deployed. You know, within budget constraints, Japan's more or less keeping on track. A couple things to watch, and this is a problem for us too. We have more batteries than we do missiles, not literally, but we don't have enough missiles. So readiness is an issue, and I think something that Congress, that think tanks need to really think about. If you have a beautiful shining THAAD battery or PAC batteries and you don't have enough missiles to fight for X number of hours or days, that's a problem. So we, the Japanese allies, need to think about that. The Japanese really haven't done anything on hardening. That's hard politically at a place like Kadena or Yokota, but it is an issue. They've done a lot on dispersal because they have a lot of runways all over the place. Right now, based on the defense guidelines, Japan relies on shared early warning. You know, one question is, should Japan have its own semi-indigenous early warning? Maybe a US system on a Japanese satellite. I think there's going to be a lot of merit to that because space assets are not going to be secure. And we're going to want resiliency and redundancy, and the Japanese having an interoperable early warning system would be good. But they're pretty solidly on board with this plan. Korea, you know, over half of Koreans and Poles support the deployment of THAAD. The Koreans on paper are planning to have 8 or 9 Aegis, but they don't have the interceptors or the capability to do missile defense. I think they should. As I said, the threat to China or to China's deterrent is minimal. So this really gets to the question of whether China gets to dictate Korean security. And I am a fan of Park Geun-hye, but I think the government as a whole has played this very badly. The theory is that if you're cautious on things like that, then China will help you on North Korea. Question, what has China done for South Korea on North Korea in the last 4 years? Answer, nothing, except for one thing. They have summits now with the South Koreans without meeting Kim Jong-un. That's new. They would have done that anyway because Xi Jinping can't stand Kim Jong-un. So I don't think the Koreans have gotten any terribly immeasurable amount of security for this position. On the other hand, if you want China to use its considerable leverage, 90% of food and fuel for North Korea comes from China. If you want China to use its leverage, then you need to disabuse Beijing of the idea that time is on their side. That, you know, why pressure North Korea and risk instability now when in 10, 20, 30 years, China will be in a position to kind of dictate both Koreas? How do you break that assumption? By showing that North Korean actions are moving the ROK closer to the US and closer to our other allies and developing the kind of missile defense capabilities that are enduring. So I think actually the answer to the North Korea problem and getting Chinese leverage on North Korea for Seoul is to do missile defense. That would be the best card they could play. But it's not there right now. The relations with Japan are getting better, But that bilateral piece, a GSOMIA, an information sharing agreement, it's hard for me to see that happening in the next year or two. So we'll have to do things like Amy mentioned, a trilateral agreement where it passes through us, step by step, work this with our friends in Korea. So to conclude, there are a lot of challenges, there are a lot of questions, but it is really an essential part, not just of our military strategy. I think missile defense is an essential underpinning of our grand strategy for the whole region.
Great, thank you. I think this was an excellent setup for our discussion that'll follow, and I like how all of you weaved in the geopolitical dynamics that really inform all this, and that was extremely helpful. I'm ready to open the floor, but if there's, well, Richard's ready. I was going to say, if there's not an immediate question, I'll slip one in. So I'll slip one in and then go to Richard. Mike, you talked, and I'll address this to you, but Amy, please feel free to offer your thoughts as well. You talked a fair amount about China and seemed to indicate that it seemed to be a dual message, at least to me, that much of what we're doing, if not all of what we're doing in terms of missile defense, active defenses, shouldn't concern them because their missiles have been redeployed. It's outside the threat envelope. They could saturate and overwhelm anyway. But yet you also said it's not just about the numbers. It's about a comprehensive approach to missile defense, which would include hardening, which would include dispersal, and active defense is a part of that. So maybe it is about China a little bit. So the question is, how do we think about China, and how do we talk about our approach to missile defense in Asia? Should it be primarily about reassurance that it's not directed at you, or should it be about deterrence that it's partly about you because it's part of a comprehensive approach? Or is it dual messages? Is one public, one private? And so,
if I were in government, I'd probably say it's all about North Korea, which is the safe thing to say. The reality is, I was speaking specifically about THAAD deployments for USFK. The THAAD deployment in Korea does not have any significant material impact on China's deterrent. So that, in that case.
but some are inclined, even more broadly and generally, to say this is not about China as a reassurance. But
when you're talking about the THAAD deployment in Guam, for example, or you're talking about missile defense with Japan, it was driven originally and is operationally now, and in terms of military strategy, largely about North Korea, and we can handle that threat. But it clearly has to be and is part of our strategy with regard to China. And the China problem is much, much harder. But in the case of China, it's a much denser set of instruments we have, and including diplomacy and alliances and economics. And so complicating Chinese planning in a way is easier than North Korea because they have more to lose from a conflict and more of a stake in a good relationship with us. And so even though the problem's harder, you still get marginal benefit. So I don't know if that answers your question, but there's different, the theater, the peninsula is different from the maritime domain, and that's one reason. But also, the BMD is part of a larger grand strategy. It doesn't solve the missile problem, but it
thank you.
contributes to solving it.
And Amy, on this same question, any thoughts on the issue, but also your sense of members of Congress, if they think about ballistic missile defense in Asia as primarily a North Korea issue, or is China in the equation, or how are they dealing with it?
Well, China is a part of every equation, according to any member of Congress. But speaking specifically on missile defense, I haven't heard much in my very short time that I've been on the Hill. I've only been in this position for about 4 months, so largely any major consideration of missile defense, of defense issues in Northeast Asia do center on North Korea and the provocations, the endless cycle of provocation and asking for humanitarian aid and those types of things without necessarily any repercussions from our end kind of puts us in a bind. But when we get down to it and think about the sort of threat that the major threat in Asia is definitely North Korea, because with all the people that consider and try to figure out this puzzle, there's no one right answer, and there's no one proven way to engage or punish or work with North Korea that has given us any sort of desirable results that we seek.
Thank you. Richard.
Thanks, Richard White, Hudson Institute. Just a related question on China. The Chinese periodically say that they are conducting a ballistic missile mid-course ground missile defense test. And in theory, if they were to engage in missile defense programs and activities, then it would be, you could work out some arrangement with them and what would be permissible, what would be controlled, and how. But most experts seem to think at most they're just testing the capability so they can overcome it. And in practice, most of these tests are really just anti-satellite tests, which they just call missile defense tests because we have missile defense tests, so they can, if they say that's what it is, and it's not a problem. I guess you're nodding your head that's your interpretation, Michael. I just wasn't sure what anyone thought about that.
Well, it's an anti-satellite capability.
Yeah.
Are you asking whether we should engage in some kind
whether
of arms
they
control?
or whether you think they're serious about ever doing, not ever, but in the immediate future, engaging in missile defense program?
You should answer some of these too.
Well, they have longstanding research in this area, research and development in this area. And I think for the Chinese, perhaps the beauty of it is it's not an either or necessarily. It's not a mutually exclusive. They can approach the program with a particular orientation. It's so that we can learn, to overcome and defeat. But all the while, they're developing a capability along the way that may be useful for them. My experience with arms control, I mean, it would be overly generous to even call it that, but any kind of diplomacy with China when it comes to their missiles, to think that we could get into a discussion that would lead to, you suggested, an ABM-like or some.
We had an agreement with the Russians about what was
Yeah, right.
A couple decades ago, what was permissible because it's mid-range versus long range. So.
I'd be very pessimistic about that.
I also think the Chinese, and Ren, you ought to come to this too, but I think the PLA concern now is not ballistic missiles, it's precision-guided munitions, and that's the growth area for their threat perception, not like us, ballistic missiles flying at our bases. So I'm not sure how much of a basis for a discussion you could have, because they'd want to get at our precision-guided munitions and forward-deployed forces and things that it'd be an apples and oranges kind of discussion. But I do think that it should be part of a broader discussion with Beijing about what people call strategic stability. And not just for us, by the way, but for Japan and others who are fielding missile defense. This actually, one of the side effects of when Japan started getting serious about deploying missile defenses, the Chinese agreed around 98 or so to get serious about talking about strategic stability with Japan. And they began having a discussion precisely because Japan had skin in the game with missile defense. They obviously don't have an offensive capability. So it should be part of a broader dialogue, but a kind of ABM type arrangement, for me, hard to see.
If you're talking about anti-satellite capabilities, I mean, I could see how, in addition to targeting our precision-guided munitions, it would be a serious concern for us. But, as what Randy said, I don't necessarily think that we could make forward progress in having some sort of substantive dialogue on creating any sort of norms or rules on the conduct of their behavior, whether they call it a mid-course ground missile defense or an anti-satellite test.
Ian.
Thanks.
Ian paid for this microphone, so he gets as Ronald Reagan once said.
And the cookies.
Practice hardening and dispersal.
Yeah.
Two countries haven't really mentioned that directly about their potential roles in a regional Asia-Pacific missile defense architecture, and that's Australia and Taiwan. And I'd be interested in your perspectives on what challenges do they pose, what potentials do they offer, can they be used to catalyze regional collaboration and development of an architecture?
Australia is a little bit schizophrenic on this issue. The Labor Party, in the era of Star Wars and Reagan, became hysterical, very anti-nuclear to begin with. That's why when the Labor Party did its defense white paper under Kevin Rudd, they were very anti-missile defense. But the Australian military, which is expeditionary, is putting into the fleet two amphibs, is going to be going places around the world. They want missile defense capability for force protection. And so it's going to be, and then the other complication is their budget's not as big as Japan's. The Australian Army's smaller than the US Marine Corps. So it'll be budget issues, a little bit of politics, but I think at a more incremental pace that they'll be in. And I think the Abbott government is also interested in missile defense because they are developing a security relationship with Japan that's becoming pretty sophisticated, and this would be part of it. So I think we're on a pretty good track, but we're not going to see it evolve as quickly as we did with Japan, would be my guess. And Taiwan, hardening. But PAC-3, I don't know. Beyond that, they have a case for Aegis, but.
Well, I don't know if you wanted to get into it. Well, they also have very good radar capability. So in terms of integrating into having a common picture, my understanding, I don't fully know the technical details, but the strategic reconnaissance radar that they've built with the help of our friends at Raytheon has very deep coverage into China, deeper than any other land-based or ship-based system. Maybe not, it would complement satellite coverage, but I think integrating them into the operating environment, the operating picture, is something we could consider. I mean, with Taiwan, there's the political considerations. We try to avoid alliance-like things to prove that we don't have a formal relationship, to prove that it's not a operational alliance. But I think in this particular area, that would be attractive to us and others, and we could pursue that.
The other problem Taiwan has is they're kind of inside cruise missile range. And that's a hard problem. So it's a piece of the solution. It's not as big a piece as it would be for us or Japan, in my view. But it is a piece of the solution, missile defense.
Sir.
Did you want to?
From your perspectives, contrast the advantages and disadvantages of sea-based versus land-based missile defense.
Well, I mean, sea-based for Japan is a pretty obvious solution aside from the PAC-3s. There's talk of THAAD, but basically for two reasons. One is Japan is a maritime power, and the Navy has the mission. They're very good at it. They're somewhat expeditionary. And the second reason is there's not a lot of real estate in Japan. So THAAD is complicated. And as you may know, there's talk of Aegis ashore. And aside from the budgetary issue, it's considered a good option, but the budgetary issue is huge. So that would be sort of the land option for Japan. We need all of the above, the U.S. of A. Korea, if they have 8 or 9 Aegis destroyers, cruisers, that's a lot. And they're going to also be with us in an expeditionary role potentially. But just extended air defense, it seems like an awful lot of Aegis platforms for just extended air defense, and it would be much more logical for Korea to start moving towards missile defense. The ballistic missile threat from North Korea is getting harder and harder. It's not static. It's getting harder. And the North Koreans are pouring more money into it because they're not able to do combined arms maneuvers or fly their planes very well. We counter battery fire and shooting back can take care of the problem, 48 hours after they've launched a lot of Scud variants and things. And then for us, moving south and consolidating in Camp Humphreys, and the need to protect Busan and other ports for reinforcements and so forth, all those, to me, create a real requirement for Korea to have more missile defense capability on these Aegis than they're talking about now, as a military requirement.
I'd agree, yeah.
Okay. Ma'am?
Hi, Jen Judson with Politico. Given the complications you've all discussed, is there a possibility or a need for something like a European phased adaptive approach in Asia? And what could that feasibly look like? Earlier, Cartwright said the Asia-Pacific missile defense approach would look very different than in Europe in that it would augment missile defense with mobile capabilities but rely on fixed capabilities. But in Asia, it would be in reverse. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that as well.
Yeah. I mean, I would just reiterate a lot of the things that I mentioned earlier about how a lot of the historical tensions, cultural issues, and as well as the different geography kind of complicate the situation. In addition to that, you add the factor of North Korea, a kind of non-compliant state in the middle of everything, just complicates the issue tremendously, and I think would put a big impediment on the Asia-Pacific phase adaptive approach. As I mentioned earlier, I think the U.S. is ready to go and continue to improve our capabilities in the region. I would say the ball is in Asia's court right now.
I think Haas Cartwright makes an interesting point because, 10 years ago, it was overwhelmingly mobile, Aegis. I think as the threat has matured, and particularly to Guam, to the southern part of the Korean Peninsula, now people are talking about THAAD, and so we're going to need all of the above.
Sir?
Hi, Raj Boya, no affiliation. My question is specific to India. I'm going to mention a couple of facts. Indo-China War that took place a few decades ago, and a great relationship between India and USSR, a historic relationship, and improved relations between US and India now. And concern in India regarding China's aggressive military posture. So in this context, what are your thoughts on the kind of role US is going to play down the line in 10, 20 years in the Indian subcontinent? Thank you.
I think there are.
Go ahead. No,
Okay.
you should go.
I'll just speak from a general point. I think that the sense from at least Congress, I believe, is there's a lot of opportunity for collaboration between the United States and India on defense capabilities. We've seen a growing need for modernization of India's defense forces, as well as new and unseen before threats in the Indian Ocean and the southeastern part of India. And so there's a lot of opportunities for there to be greater collaboration. I think a lot of the people in Congress, too, are reinvigorated by the new leader, Prime Minister Modi, and hope that, in his tenure that they could continue to discuss new ways to have defense collaboration and potentially going into ballistic missile defense capabilities.
I remember in, April, I think it was, maybe May 2001, at the beginning of the Bush administration, I was in the NSC, Randy was working as Deputy Secretary Armitage's Chief of Staff. You probably went with him on the trip, but Rich went on this trip around the world to explain we were going to get out of the ABM treaty. And all the pundits and the New York Times and everybody said, oh, the Indians are going to just clobber Armitage, the non-aligned movement and their belief in, supposed belief in uncontrolled, blah, blah, blah. And you were on the trip, right? No. You weren't? Well, anyway, Rich, it was all goodness. It was all goodness. And the Indian government India faces a ballistic missile threat. And they were not only were they supportive of the administration's decision, we started talking about missile defense cooperation. Hasn't gone very far. This year, I believe, the U.S. arms sales to India will top Russia for the first time. So we have a very, very deep relationship. But a lot of the stuff we sell is not kinetic. It's C-130s and Coast Guard cutters and frigates and things that will become frigates and things like that. So India has its own indigenous programs for air defense and concepts, at least for extended air defense. And I could see us cooperating on that and helping India's indigenous capability. Somewhere 10, 20, 30 years down the road, I could see, more interoperability of systems between the U.S., Japan, India, and Australia because of the steady Chinese growth of capabilities towards the Indian Ocean way down the road. But right now, I think it's still at the level of talk and some technical cooperation, and probably will be for a little while.
One last question.
Sure.
How do you assess the state of Chinese missile defense systems? How do they compare to Russia's, United States?
Well, I think we're getting at it a little bit with Richard's question. I mean, it's been a long-standing program for research and development, primarily probably for the purpose of learning how to defeat and deal with missile defenses in the hands of others. And Mike added to that with a very, very good point. For the most part, other countries have imposed constraints on themselves when it comes to short-range, medium-range ballistic missiles. So the threat that others face from China, they're not facing, from Japan, Korea. Their threat is different. It's the precision-guided munitions. So I don't think they've had the same sense of urgency to develop, operational capability. It's been more oriented towards them learning about the capability more generally and how to defeat and overwhelm it. That said, they can at any point turn this program of research and development into something deployable if they make enough advances. I just don't think that they are really prioritizing it because it's not their primary threat that they face. If the geopolitics were to change with Russia or developments elsewhere in the region, if others got more serious about offensive capabilities and looked at this particular kind of capability, then they might get more serious about it.
I mean, you'll know this figure better than I, Randy, but the deployment of ballistic missiles by China has been close to 100 a year for a long, long time. So I think by an order of magnitude, if you looked at ballistic missile deployers, it'd be China, and then a big gap, and then probably North Korea, and then Iran, Pakistan. I think Russia's actually, they're making a lot of noise, but then modernizing, but they're in there somewhere. So China's way ahead of the entire world in the pace and capability of ballistic missile deployments. And when they worry about nuclear deterrence, their answer for survivability is numbers, mobility, uncertainty. It's not defense of assets per se. Their best air defense system they buy from the Russians still. So technologically, if that's your question, they have an ASAT capability. They demonstrated that, but I think for air defense, they're probably either below the Russians technologically. I assume because they're buying their best systems. The ones we were the most are not Chinese; they're Russian.
We could maybe have one more, or we can wrap up if there's no other questions. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. This question is for Amy and also for Dr. Green. You said the missile defense actually would have a bigger power projections, and it has a bigger impact on the U.S. leadership globally, and hopefully it would have a lot of effect on the current chaos in the South China Sea. So geopolitically, I would like to hear from both of you regarding how the South China Sea, the current tensions, and how the current capability of the U.S. and the whole other powers in the world regarding missile defense would have the effect on that. And one way or the other, how would the outcome of the conflicts in the South China Sea would impact the stability of the world, and what would Amy suggest Congress to do about it? Thank you.
So I think there's a specific question
Well,
about...
it does kind of relate.
Yeah.
I mean, so 10, 15 years ago, I think the U.S. Navy assumed that if it had to go into the South China Sea to deal with a Taiwan scenario or any other scenario involving China, they could do it. Now, not so sure. So China has reclaimed land on 7 islands now, and is in my prediction, going to put significant military assets on them in September or sometime after Xi Jinping comes to Washington. They're a little bit of a timeout now. We, the U.S., allies and partners, will have to decide how do we demonstrate that this doesn't change our freedom of navigation, which means we'll probably send, and we already sent a P-8, we'll send more ships through, but the defense of those ships will be a lot more complicated. And if bases in Japan, if our alliance with Japan, our alliance with Australia, if our bases in Guam or Hawaii seem vulnerable, if we seem afraid, it's going to be a lot harder to deal with that problem. And I think that's China's assumption. So it relates to areas where we may never use missile defense because the whole U.S. force posture has to be credible to dissuade China from thinking that coercion will work in the South China Sea. And the reverse is true in a way. We have to show we have the willpower not to be intimidated in the South China Sea to make it clear we won't be intimidated more broadly when there are threats to our force posture.
People often make the argument that the United States can't necessarily, because they don't have a stake in the South China Sea, that they can't have a say on the issue. Well, I mean, first of all, I would disagree in that we have a stake in the freedom of navigation and open seas and freedom of commerce through those waters. And having someone militarizing and building islands is an unacceptable thing for us. And so, to what extent that we could help provide capabilities for our partners and allies in the region to be able to bolster defenses or to improve greater codes of conduct or norms and rules of the road for how to conduct in ambiguous territories, conduct behavior in ambiguous territories is valued. And I think that's where our leadership can really shine through, because we have experiences as like a global expeditionary force with our Navy in all major areas of the world to be able to set the kind of precedents for appropriate behavior in these very contested areas. In terms of what the United States Congress can do is I think they can continue having these types of hearings. We're also holding a South China Sea hearing later in July as well, so be on the lookout for that. And we can integrate and cross-pollinate on a lot of these issues, integrating ballistic missile defense, integrating greater partnerships and allies in the region with how do we address very contentious and difficult issues in Asia, be it South China Sea, be it North Korea, be it how to really think about dealing with China in the future as well.
Can I make one final macro point that builds on Amy's excellent comments? The objective of U.S. policy should not be to defeat China in a war. Right. The objective of U.S. policy is to have a productive relationship with China based on an order in Asia where smaller states aren't coerced, where the rules we know are basically the rules. We can adjust and fine-tune and work with China on that, and where it's underpinned by U.S. leadership. So I think the point we're all making is not we'll use missile defense to get China. The point of missile defense is it reinforces the structures and relationships in place so that Beijing is not tempted to think that they could break our will or break our relations with our allies and change the status quo or the dynamics without paying a very high price. Yeah.
Well, thanks to Kurt Campbell and Abstentia. Thanks to Amy and Bravo Zulu today on your commissioning. And thank you, Dr. Green.